She didn't cry. That was the thing nobody expected. When the hostess gripped Nia Brooks by the elbow, not asking, just steering, the way you'd move a piece of furniture that ended up in the wrong room, and guided her past table after glittering table, past senators laughing too loud and executives checking their watches, past women in gowns that cost more than Nia's monthly rent, all the way to a folding chair wedged beside the service entrance where the smell of dish soap mixed with expensive perfume. Nia didn't cry. She sat down. She unfolded her napkin. She smiled at the busboy who looked more horrified than she felt. And somewhere above them all, on a screen no one knew existed, a man with cold gray eyes and a reputation built on making problems disappear, watched every single second of it. He hadn't touched his drink in 11 minutes. If that had been you, if someone had taken your arm and walked you to the back, like you were an inconvenience, like your award meant nothing, like your presence embarrassed them, what would you have done? Would you have left? Would you have said something? Or would you have done what Nia did and stayed because leaving would have meant they won? Before we go any further, if you're new here, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because the story you're about to hear doesn't end where you think it does, and you will not want to miss what happens next. Drop a like on this video and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Nia Brooks had not planned to attend the Bellaforte Gala. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, tucked inside a thick cream envelope that looked wildly out of place on the folding table she used as a desk at the East Side Community Kitchen. She'd been in the middle of portioning out tomorrow's lunch prep. 300 servings of chicken and rice for the senior center, which she'd been doing every Wednesday for 4 years without a grant, without a sponsor, and usually without enough volunteers. She almost threw the envelope away, thinking it was one of those fake sweepstakes mailers her mother used to warn her about. Her assistant Deja had opened it instead. Nia. Deja's voice had gone flat in that way it did when something was either very good or very strange. You've been invited to the Romano Syndicate Foundation Gala. Nia looked up from her cutting board. The what? Deja turned the envelope over, checked both sides like there might be an explanation hiding on the back. The Romano Syndicate Foundation. They do that charity thing every year at the Bellaforte estate, the big one, the one where the governor shows up and pretends he cares about poor people for one night. Nia had heard of it vaguely. Everyone had. It was the kind of event that existed in a different atmosphere, the kind you saw photographed in the style section of the paper, all crystal and couture and people air-kissing over champagne flutes. She'd never paid much attention to it because it had nothing to do with her world. Her world was cracked tile floors and second-hand industrial ovens and teenagers who came in after school because they had nowhere better to go, and sometimes no one at home either. Why are they inviting me? She asked. Deja had read the letter 3 times by then. Because your nonprofit won the Citywide Humanitarian Service Award, the one they fund. So apparently you're supposed to come accept it at their gala. She paused. In 3 weeks. Nia wiped her hands on her apron, stared at the envelope, thought about all the reasons not to go, the cost of a gown she didn't own, the time she didn't have, the world she would be walking into that had never once included a woman who looked like her. Then she thought about her kids, the teenagers who sat in her kitchen and learned to make something out of nothing, the ones who needed to see that someone who looked like them could walk through any door. I'll need a dress, she said. She found it at a consignment shop on Morrison Street, floor-length emerald green, structured at the shoulders, simple in a way that felt intentional rather than modest. The woman who owned the shop altered it for her at half price because she'd once sent her grandson to Nia's after-school cooking program, and the boy had come home making pasta from scratch and crying about it in the best way. Nia stood in front of her bathroom mirror the night of the gala for a long time. She wasn't the kind of woman who spent a lot of energy worrying about what she looked like. She'd made peace with her body the hard way, the way most women do, through years of other people's opinions chipping at her until she got tired of handing them the chisel. She knew she was beautiful. She also knew that certain rooms would not see her that way, and she'd learned to walk into those rooms anyway, chin level, eyes forward, because the alternative was standing outside forever. She thought about her mother, who used to say, "Don't you dare make yourself smaller so someone else feels bigger. You take up your space." She took a breath. She went to the gala. The Bellaforte estate at night was the kind of thing that made you understand why fairy tales existed. The driveway alone was a quarter-mile of lit lanterns and pruned hedges. Valets materialized out of the dark. Women arrived in cars Nia couldn't name. The air smelled different here, like money, she thought, which she'd always assumed was a metaphor but turned out to be an actual smell, a mixture of fresh flowers and expensive fabric, and something underneath it all that was either cedar or ambition. The woman at the entrance checked Nia's name against the list with the particular efficiency of someone who had been trained to smile at everyone equally and had never quite mastered it. She found the name. Her smile stayed in place, but something shifted behind her eyes. A millisecond recalibration that Nia had seen 10,000 times and never once gotten used to. Of course, Ms. Brooks. Right this way. She was escorted to the main ballroom, which was everything the invitation had implied, and somehow still more than that. A vaulted ceiling hung with crystal chandeliers that threw prismatic light across the walls, round tables draped in ivory linen, centerpieces that probably cost what Nia paid in monthly groceries for the kitchen. Hundreds of people already filled the space, and the sound was that particular blend of live orchestra and money talk that has its own specific frequency. Nia's assigned seat was at table 7, center room. Good placement, actually, close to the podium where the award ceremony would take place. She found it easily enough and set her small bag on the back of the chair and stood there for a moment, taking in the room, trying to locate the bar, because she had the feeling she might need it. That was when she heard it, not loud. That was the thing about this kind of cruelty. It never announced itself. It whispered, it adjusted. It worked through polite channels so that by the time you understood what had happened, everyone involved had plausible deniability. A woman in silver sequins, seated 2 chairs away, was speaking to the hostess, the one with the tablet, the one responsible for arrangements. Nia couldn't hear the full conversation. She caught fragments, uncomfortable, and then, surely something can be arranged. And then the hostess glanced over very quickly and looked away. Nia kept her expression neutral. She'd had years of practice. Within 4 minutes, a second woman, someone's wife, from the look of the rock on her hand, approached the hostess from a different direction and gestured vaguely at table 7. Another fragment drifted over, the optics, and then, our clients are seated there, the optics. Nia thought about her kids again, thought about Marcus, 16 years old, who'd asked her once why rich people were the way they were. She hadn't had a good answer then. She was getting one now. The hostess walked over with the expression of someone delivering terrible news about a flight delay. Ms. Brooks? Her voice was warm in the artificial way of people trained for hospitality. I'm so sorry for the inconvenience. There's been an adjustment to the seating plan, a last-minute conflict with some of our major donors. We need to relocate you just temporarily. I hope you understand. Nia looked at her for a long moment. Where? The hostess led her across the room and kept going, past table 6, past table 9, past the secondary seating area where the less important guests sat, past the dessert station, all the way to the far edge of the ballroom where the decorative partition met the door that led to the catering corridor, where the noise of the kitchen was a low, constant rumble on the other side of the wall, and the lighting was 3 degrees dimmer because nobody important was supposed to sit here. There was a table, 2 chairs, a place setting that looked like it had been assembled hastily, because it had been. Again, I'm so sorry for the inconvenience, the hostess said, already backing away. Your award presentation will proceed as planned. You'll be called to the stage when the time comes. She left. Nia stood there. The busboy, 18, maybe 19, a kid with nervous hands who'd probably been working this job for 2 weeks, came to fill her water glass and couldn't quite meet her eyes. Can I get you anything, ma'am? Nia sat down, smoothed her napkin across her lap, looked at him directly. What's your name? He blinked. Tomas. How long have you been working here, Tomas? Tonight's my 3rd event. He looked confused, like he was expecting a complaint and didn't know what to do with a question. You're doing great, she said. The water glasses were already filled when I sat at the other table. That's good attention to detail. He stared at her for another second. Then he said, Thank you, ma'am, and walked away with slightly better posture than he'd arrived with. Nia turned toward the wall and breathed for 3 slow counts. She did not cry. She did not leave. She picked up her fork, and she waited for dinner. What happened next, she would think about for years. Not the part where they moved her. She'd been moved before, figuratively and literally, more times than she could count. Not the part where no one intervened. She'd stopped expecting intervention a long time ago. What she would think about was her own decision to stay, to sit in that chair and refuse to be diminished by it. Because staying took something she couldn't quite name, something beyond pride, something closer to conviction. The belief that her presence was worth the discomfort it caused other people, that she didn't owe anyone the relief of her absence. She thought about the award sitting somewhere backstage in its velvet box. She thought about the letter that had come with the invitation, describing her work in careful, admiring language. Exceptional service, measurable community impact, a model of leadership. And then she thought about the hostess's face, and the sequined woman's gesture, and the phrase "the optics." And she allowed herself exactly 1 minute of cold, specific rage before she folded it up and put it somewhere she could examine later. Then she saw the volunteers. 3 of them, clustered near the back wall in ill-fitting rented formal wear, clearly terrified, clearly running through their speeches in their heads, with the particular frozen expression of people who would rather be anywhere else on earth. High school students, she guessed, scholarship recipients probably, here to speak about what the Foundation's support had meant to them, and currently looking like they might evaporate from sheer anxiety. Nia excused herself from her isolated table, walked over, and said, "Hey, first time speaking in front of a crowd this size?" All 3 turned to look at her with the relief of drowning people spotting a boat. The girl in the middle, 17 maybe, with her hair pinned in a style that looked like it had taken 3 hours, said, "Is it that obvious?" "It's extremely obvious," Nia said, "which is completely fine, because most people in this room are paying less attention than you think. Can I tell you something that actually helps?" She didn't wait for an answer. Find one person in the audience who's smiling, not applauding, smiling, like they're just happy to be there, happy for you. Focus on them. The rest stops mattering. The girl looked at her. "How do you know?" "Because I've done it about 40 times, Nia said, "and I was bad at it for the first 35. Something loosened in the girl's shoulders. She almost smiled. They talked for 11 minutes, Nia standing beside the wall in her emerald gown. These 3 kids gradually unclenching, asking questions, laughing at things they weren't sure it was okay to laugh at. She told them about the first speech she'd ever given, at a community board meeting when she was 23 and trying to save a neighborhood garden, and how she'd mispronounced infrastructure 3 times, and the board president had corrected her each time with a look that said she had no business being in the room. "And then the garden got saved anyway," she said. So, she didn't tell them about her table. She didn't tell them about the optics. On the 3rd floor of the Belafort estate, in a room that did not appear on any publicly available floor plan, a bank of monitors displayed 42 different angles of the ballroom below. Cassian Viscari had been watching for 22 minutes. He was not supposed to be in this country. There were 3 time zones and a scheduled meeting in Vienna between him and this moment, and he had ended the Vienna meeting 40 minutes early because something in his chest had gone wrong on the flight over. Not medically, nothing like that, just a feeling. The specific unease of a man who had spent 30 years trusting his instincts about when something was about to go sideways. He'd watched the original seating from the air. He'd watched Table 7 get reconfigured. He'd watched the hostess's route across the ballroom, that long, deliberate walk to the corner, the apologetic gesture, the retreat. He'd replayed it twice on the tablet his security chief handed him without comment. His name was Dario, the security chief. He'd worked for Cassian for 11 years and had learned that silence was sometimes the most useful thing he could offer. "Who requested the change?" Cassian asked. Dario had the names ready. He always had the names ready. Senator Whitmore's wife initiated the first complaint. The Hargrove Group, the real estate people, followed within about 3 minutes. A few others added on after that. It escalated quickly. Cassian said nothing. On the monitor, the woman in the emerald gown was standing near the back wall, talking to 3 teenagers who looked like they'd been bracing for execution. As he watched, one of them, a girl with her hair pinned up, laughed at something the woman said. A real laugh. Not the polite kind. Cassian studied the woman's face, the way she held herself. The precise and deliberate warmth she was giving these kids while sitting in the most publicly humiliating position a guest could occupy at an event like this, and apparently deciding to use that position as a waiting room rather than a punishment. He put down his drink. "Get me the full guest manifest," he said. And pull everything we have on Whitmore and Hargrove. He paused. And find out who she is. Dario already had that too. He handed over a single sheet. Nia Brooks, founder and director of the Eastside Community Kitchen Initiative, youth mentorship programs, senior meal deliveries, after-school culinary education for at-risk teenagers. Award winner, this award, the one this entire foundation supposedly existed to celebrate. Cassian read the page once, then he looked at the monitor again. The girl's shoulders had dropped 2 inches. She was no longer holding her notes in a death grip. She was listening to Nia with the specific attention of someone receiving information they didn't know they needed. One more thing, Cassian said. I want a new seating chart ready in 40 minutes. Dario blinked. In 11 years, Cassian had never intervened in event logistics. Sir? 40 minutes, Cassian said. And get the foundation auditors on the phone. Tonight. He picked up his jacket from the chair. We're going to make some adjustments. He walked toward the door, then he stopped. And Dario. Sir? Don't tell anyone I'm here yet. Down in the ballroom, the orchestra was warming up for the pre-dinner set, and Nia had returned to her table by the service entrance because the kids had needed to go find their seats, and she didn't want them to see her standing by the wall alone, which would have raised questions she didn't feel like answering. She sat with her water glass and a bread roll she wasn't particularly hungry for and watched the room function the way these rooms always functioned. The careful navigation of status, the unspoken calculations, who approached whom, who waited to be approached, the geography of power expressed through cocktail party movement. She had spent her whole career in rooms that didn't want her in them. City council chambers where she'd had to fight for permits. Bank offices where loan officers had looked at her business plan with expressions of exhausting patience. Neighborhood association meetings where she'd been the only person under 50 and the only black woman, and somehow both of those things had felt like violations of some unwritten rule she hadn't been given a copy of. She was tired of it, if she was being honest. Not tonight specifically. Tonight was just one more. But in the accumulated way, the way you get tired of carrying something you've been carrying for so long you've almost forgotten what it weighed at the beginning. She broke off a piece of the bread roll. She thought, I'm here. I showed up. My kids will hear that I showed up. She thought, that has to be enough. And it was, almost. Except for the part of her, the part that her mother had probably put there, the stubborn, inconvenient part. That was watching a senator laugh with a man she recognized from news articles about housing displacement and was thinking very clearly, somebody should do something about this. She just didn't know yet that someone already had. The bread roll was getting cold. Nia had been breaking it into smaller and smaller pieces without eating any of them, which was something she did when her mind was working on a problem her hands hadn't been told about yet. The orchestra had moved from warm-up scales into something slow and European that she didn't recognize, and the ballroom had settled into its pre-dinner rhythm, that particular hum of 400 people who all knew each other from other rooms just like this one, performing the specific theater of people who have arrived. Nobody looked at her table. That was the thing she hadn't anticipated. Not the hostility. She'd expected some version of that. What she hadn't expected was the erasure. The way people's eyes simply slid past her corner like her table was a piece of the wall, like the service entrance behind her was more architecturally interesting than the woman sitting 3 feet in front of it. She had been moved from the center of the room to its absolute margin, and the message wasn't subtle. You are not part of this picture. She ate a piece of this bread. It tasted like nothing. Tomas came back to refill her water glass, even though it was still 3/4 full. She appreciated the kindness in that, the recognition, however small, that she was a person who deserved the same attention as the tables where the carafes were actually running low. He didn't say anything this time, just poured carefully and moved on. She watched him work his way down the catering corridor's edge, and she thought about all the invisible people in this building tonight, the kitchen staff, the coat check attendants, the security personnel at the doors, and how none of them would make it into a single photograph tomorrow morning. She was reaching for her water glass when she heard the voice. It was coming from table 3, which was close enough to the center of the room that the acoustics carried differently over there. Sound traveled outward from that table like it was designed to, like the room itself was built to amplify whatever was said there. She couldn't make out every word from where she was sitting, but she caught the tone. The specific register of a man who was accustomed to being heard and had stopped moderating his volume because he'd never needed to. The man's name was Hargrove. She knew this because she'd seen his face on a billboard once. A development project on the east side of the city, a new residential complex going up on the site of what used to be the Callaway Park neighborhood, which had been home to about 800 families before the zoning changed. She'd had 3 kids from Callaway Park in her after-school program the year the displacement happened. She remembered their faces at the kitchen table, quieter than they used to be, doing knife work with the focused silence of people who were carrying something too heavy to put down. She watched Hargrove gesture with his wine glass and say something that made the 3 men around him laugh in the particular way that men laugh when they want to signal agreement without having to say anything themselves. She looked away. She was not going to sit here and make herself miserable watching a man like that enjoy his evening. That wasn't why she'd come. She'd come because her kids needed to know that the award existed, that the work was being recognized, that the city, or some version of the city, had looked at what they were doing on Morrison Street and decided it mattered. That was the only reason. She was going to collect her award, and she was going to shake whatever hands were offered, and she was going to leave before the dancing started. That was the plan. Then Senator Whitmore's wife walked past her table. It wasn't an accident. The path from the bar back to table 1 didn't route anywhere near the service entrance. There was no logistical reason for a woman in a $70,000 gown to be walking within 6 feet of the catering corridor. She did it deliberately, slowly, with a champagne flute in one hand and a small smile that was designed to look like she wasn't looking. She was looking. Her eyes moved across Nia from the emerald gown to the solitary place setting to the bread roll that had been pulled apart into a dozen useless fragments. And the smile didn't change. It stayed exactly where it was, small and private. The smile of someone who has arranged things exactly as they intended and is confirming the result. Then she walked back toward table 1. Nia felt something shift in her chest. Not hurt. She was past hurt. Something colder than that. Something that had a specific shape and weight, like a stone she'd been handed without asking for it, and she was going to have to decide what to do with it. She set down her water glass. She pressed both palms flat against the tablecloth for exactly 2 seconds. Then she stood up, straightened the front of her gown, and walked toward the cluster of volunteers she'd spoken to earlier, because they were the only people in this building she genuinely wanted to talk to. And she was done sitting in a corner waiting to be acknowledged by people who had already made their decision about her. In the surveillance room on the 3rd floor, the atmosphere had changed. Dario stood at the primary monitor station with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the elbow, which was as close to distress as he ever showed physically. 3 of his team members were working at adjacent screens, pulling files, running financial queries, cross-referencing donor records against the foundation's public statements. The room smelled like stale coffee, and the particular tension of people who have been given 40 minutes to do work that should have taken a week. Cashin sat in the corner with the guest manifest across his knee and a pen he'd been clicking open and closed without appearing to notice he was doing it. "Whitmore first," he said. "What's the actual number?" One of the analysts, a young man named Gus, who had the permanent expression of someone who had read too many spreadsheets, pulled up a document on his screen. Foundation disbursements for the past 3 years show a recurring allocation to the Southeast Literacy Initiative. 11 million over 36 months, he paused. The Southeast Literacy Initiative incorporated 18 months ago. It has 1 employee. The employee's home address matches a property held in the senator's wife's maiden name. Cashin stopped clicking the pen. "The Literacy Initiative," he said, in a tone that wasn't a question. "It has a website," Gus said. "The website has a phone number. The phone number connects to a Google Voice account." "The Google Voice account. How long has this been in the Foundation's funding portfolio?" "Since before I was hired," Dario said. He wasn't looking at Cassian when he said it. "I was looking at the monitor, at the ballroom below, where the woman in the green dress had found the scholarship kids again and was now standing with them near the stage-left curtain. It was in place when I came on. I flagged it twice in quarterly reviews as an unusual disbursement pattern and was told it had been internally audited." Silence. "It hadn't been internally audited," Cassian said. "No." Another silence, different in quality from the first. "Who told you it had?" Dario said a name. Cassian wrote it down on the margin of the manifest. "What about Hargrove?" The second analyst, a woman named Petra, who moved through financial records with the focused calm of a surgeon, pulled her screen around so he could see it from across the room. His East Side development project received zoning expediting support from the City Planning Office 14 months ago. The Planning Office Commissioner at the time had a personal investment vehicle that received a cash infusion of, she checked the number, $420,000 30 days before the zoning vote. And the families that were displaced? Petra looked at him. 812 units, average tenancy of 11 years. Relocation assistance was legally required. She paused. Hargrove's company applied for and received a regulatory variance exempting the project from relocation assistance requirements. The variance was approved by the same planning commissioner, Cassian said. Yes. He stood up. He walked to the primary monitor and looked at the ballroom for a long moment without speaking. The orchestra had moved into something with more energy now, and the pre-dinner gathering was reaching its peak. The room at maximum animation, 400 people in their best clothes doing the thing they came here to do, which was see and be seen and confirm to each other that they still mattered. Hargrove was laughing again. Whitmore's wife was leaning over to whisper something to the woman on her left. Nia Brooks was standing with 3 teenagers who were noticeably less terrified than they had been 20 minutes ago. 43 minutes, Dario said quietly. You asked for 40. I know. Cassian turned from the monitor. Is the Foundation's legal team on site? Jeffrey's here. He came as a guest. Pull him out of the room and put him in the East Conference suite. Tell him it's urgent and don't tell him anything else. He looked at Gus. The auditors? Reached. 2 of the 3 are in the building. The 3rd is 20 minutes out. Good enough. Cassian picked up his jacket. He looked at his security chief. Dario. Sir? The seating chart. Dario handed him a single printed sheet. The new arrangement. Cassian looked at it for perhaps 4 seconds, long enough to confirm it was what he'd asked for, not long enough to second-guess it. He handed it back. Execute it, he said. But not yet. Wait for my signal. When will that be? Cassian looked at the monitor one last time. On the screen, one of the scholarship kids, the girl with the pinned hair, had said something that made Nia laugh. A real laugh, the kind that uses your whole face, the kind you can't manufacture. He watched it happen, and something in his expression shifted by about 2 degrees, which for Cassian Viscari was the equivalent of a complete change of feeling. When I'm in position, he said, and walked out the door. Down in the ballroom, the first real crack appeared at 11 minutes to 8. It started with Marcus Webb, which surprised nobody who knew him and would have surprised everyone who didn't, because Marcus Webb looked like exactly the kind of man nothing started with. 62 years old, silver-haired, wearing the kind of tuxedo that gets handed down through families. A Foundation board member for 9 years who everyone agreed was a good man in the specific way that people call someone a good man when they mean harmless. He had been watching Table 7 since Nia was moved from it. He'd been watching without doing anything, which was the condition he seemed to have accepted for himself over 9 years of board membership. Seeing things clearly and acting on approximately 30% of what he saw, because the other 70% required confrontations he'd calculated weren't worth the cost. He hated that calculation. He'd been doing it long enough to hate himself a little for it, which wasn't enough to make him stop. But then Whitmore's wife had walked past Nia's table, and he had watched her do it, and he had watched her face while she did it. He pushed back from table 4 and crossed the room to where the hostess, her name was Claire, he knew her from 4 previous galas, was standing near the podium with her tablet, updating something. Claire, he kept his voice low, which required effort, because what he actually wanted to do was the opposite of low. What happened with the seating change tonight? Claire looked up with the professional warmth of someone who has been trained to handle exactly this kind of approach. Mr. Webb, is everything... The woman in green, Nia Brooks. She was at table 7, and now she's at... He gestured toward the far corner without finishing the sentence because the gesture was sufficient. There was a scheduling conflict with several major donors, Claire said. She was good. Her voice stayed level, her face stayed composed. It was an unavoidable adjustment given the specific... Who requested it? A pause. Tiny, but visible. I don't have that information available to me right now, but I'd be happy to... Claire. He looked at her directly. I've been on this board for 9 years. I've sat at this gala 9 times. I know what an unavoidable adjustment looks like, and I know what a seating punishment looks like. Those are different things. Her composure held, but her eyes moved, just briefly, just to her left, which was the direction of table 1, where the Whitmore party was seated. It was enough. "Thank you," Marcus said. He turned around. He walked to table 1. Senator Gerald Whitmore was mid-sentence when Marcus arrived, and he finished his sentence before looking up, which was itself a statement. "Marcus, good to see you, as always." "Gerald." Marcus stood at the table's edge. He didn't sit. He didn't pretend this was a social visit. "Did you request the seating adjustment tonight? The one involving Ms. Brooks?" The table went quiet in the specific way a table of powerful people goes quiet when they realize a private thing is being spoken about out loud. Whitmore's expression didn't change, exactly, but something behind it did. "I think there may have been some scheduling complexity that required, 'That's not what I asked.'" A small, cold pause. "I don't think this is the appropriate forum for that kind of discussion," Whitmore said. "The appropriate forum," Marcus said, and he heard his own voice doing something he hadn't authorized it to do, getting louder by increments he couldn't quite control, "was before you had a woman who won this foundation's humanitarian award walk to a service entrance because you found it inconvenient to sit near her." "Marcus," someone else at the table started. "I'm talking to Gerald." He kept his eyes on the senator. 9 years I've sat on this board. 9 years we've stood at podiums and talked about dignity and community impact and the foundation's commitment to the people it serves. And tonight, in this room, the person this award was created to celebrate is eating dinner next to a kitchen door. He stopped. His hands were doing something at his sides that he brought under control with some effort. "I want to know if you're responsible for that." Whitmore set down his wine glass with the particular care of a man buying himself time. "I think you're upset, which is understandable, and perhaps we should— Are you responsible for it or not?" The silence this time was longer. And in that silence, something happened that Marcus hadn't anticipated. Hargrove from table 3 was watching, and several people from adjacent tables had turned. And the specific bubble of privacy that always surrounded powerful men at events like this had, for just a moment, popped. Whitmore looked at Marcus for a long moment. Then he said quietly and carefully, "The Foundation's events are managed by the hosting committee, which operates independently of individual donor preferences. If there was a miscommunication, Marcus repeated, then that's something we can address through appropriate channels." "She's sitting next to a dishwasher, Gerald." The table had no response to that. Not because they were moved by it, he wasn't naive enough to think that, but because the plainness of the statement, said at that volume in that room, had removed the available response options. You could not counter "she's sitting next to a dishwasher" with talking points about the hosting committee. You could only sit there and let it land. Marcus looked at the table for 3 more seconds. Then he turned and walked back toward table 4, and he sat down, and he poured himself a glass of water with a hand that was only slightly unsteady, and he thought, that accomplished nothing. And then he thought, good. It should have been said. It being said was enough. And then he thought, it wasn't enough. And then he sat with all 3 of those thoughts fighting each other while the orchestra played something that sounded increasingly inappropriate. He didn't see Cassian Vescari enter the ballroom. Nobody did, at first. He came in from the side. Not the grand entrance at the top of the staircase, not the main doors, but a service corridor access point that most guests didn't know existed. He had done that at every gala for 5 years, entering his own event from the edges, because he'd learned a long time ago that a man who controls a room does it more effectively when the room doesn't see him coming. He was not a physically imposing man in the traditional sense. Medium height, dark hair going gray at the temples, a jaw that suggested he'd been handsome in a harder way when he was younger and had aged into something more difficult to read. He wore his tuxedo the way he wore everything, without appearing to have thought about it, which meant he'd thought about it completely. He moved like a man who had somewhere to be and had already decided what would happen when he got there. His security team materialized around him at 4-meter intervals without appearing to, which they'd practiced enough that it looked natural. He moved to a position near the eastern wall, partially obscured by an arrangement of white orchids that were taller than he was, and he stood there for approximately 90 seconds. He watched the room. He watched Hargrove. He watched table 1, where Whitmore was saying something to his wife in a low, tight voice that read, as damage control even from across a ballroom. He watched Marcus Webb sitting alone at table 4 with his water glass and his specific expression of a man chewing on something that wouldn't digest. He watched the corner by the service entrance, where Nia Brooks had returned to her table and was sitting with the composed stillness of a woman who has decided to be exactly where she is, fully and without apology, even when where she is has been designed to diminish her. She was sitting straight. He noticed that specifically, the posture. Not performing dignity, not defying anything, just sitting the way a person sits when they refuse to allow their spine to record what's being done to them. He turned to Dario, who had appeared soundlessly at his left. The auditors are in position? East Conference Suite. Jeffrey's with them. Good. He was quiet for another moment. The display system for the seating charts. Ready when you are. Cassian looked at the room one more time. The orchestra was reaching the end of its pre-dinner set. In 7 minutes, the lights would cue for the dinner announcement and the ceremony would begin. The welcome remarks, the award presentations, the careful management of gratitude and generosity that these events existed to perform. 7 minutes. Signal the kitchen to hold the first course, Cassian said. Dario looked at him. For how long? Until I tell them otherwise. The catering director is going to put... I know. Dario spoke quietly into his earpiece. Cassian pushed away from the wall and began walking, not toward the center of the room, not yet, but toward table 3, where Hargrove was finishing a story that was making the men around him laugh again. That particular laugh, the one that required nothing of anyone except agreement with a man who had never once been told no. He was 20 feet away when Hargrove looked up. The laughter stopped. Not because Cassian said anything, not because his security team did anything. Just because of the quality of the approach, something in the direction of it, the lack of social performance, the absence of the smile that every other person in this room had deployed when walking toward a table. Hargrove had been in enough rooms with enough dangerous people to recognize when something was not a greeting. He sat up straighter. Cassian stopped at the edge of the table. He looked at Hargrove for a moment that lasted several seconds too long for comfort. Then he said, quietly enough that only the immediate table could hear, I wanted to thank you personally for attending tonight. Hargrove blinked, recalibrated. Cassian. Didn't know you were... I thought you were in Vienna. I was. He smiled, and it didn't reach anything above his mouth. Plans change. He let another beat pass. I understand you had some input into the evening's seating arrangements. The other men at table 3 had gone very still. Hargrove made a sound that was supposed to be a laugh. I think there may have been a small request through the committee, just a logistical thing. The humanitarian award winner, Cassian said, is sitting next to the dishwasher station. The words landed like something physical. I'm sure that wasn't, I know what it was. His voice hadn't changed volume, it hadn't changed tone. It had simply become the kind of voice that fills a space completely, the way cold does, the way silence does, without effort. I watched it from the security room. I watched the whole thing. Hargrove's face was doing something complicated. Enjoy your dinner, Robert, Cassian said. We'll talk later. He moved away from the table before Hargrove could formulate a response, which was deliberate, and as he walked, he felt the room's temperature change. Not literally, but in the specific social way of a space where something has shifted and everyone present can feel it, but nobody is quite sure what it is yet. He crossed the ballroom floor. He was 15 feet from the service corridor corner when Nia looked up. She saw a man she didn't recognize walking toward her table with the kind of purpose that didn't belong in the peripheral corner of a ballroom, and her first instinct was the one she'd spent 20 years developing in neighborhood spaces where strangers who moved with purpose often meant something was wrong. Her shoulders came forward slightly. Her chin came up. He stopped in front of her table. He said, Ms. Brooks. Not a question. She looked at him. That depends on who's asking. Something moved in his face. Barely. My name is Cassian Vescari. This is my foundation. A beat of silence while Nia processed that information and what it meant about the evening and what it meant about who had been making decisions and what it meant that the man who owned all of this was standing in front of her isolated corner table at 11 minutes to 8. Your foundation, she said. Yes. The same foundation that just walked me from the center table to, she gestured briefly at the service door behind her. Here. Yes. And you're here because what happened tonight in my building, at my event, to the person this award was created to recognize. He paused, and something in his voice went flat and factual in a way that was more effective than anger. Is not something I'm going to let stand. Nia looked at him for a long moment. She'd learned to read people in small rooms over 20 years, across kitchen tables, across community center folding tables, across the aluminum counter of the food service window where she'd watched 1,000 faces decide whether or not to trust something. She read this face now with the same attention she brought to all of it. He wasn't performing. What are you going to do? She asked. He held her gaze. I'm going to need you to trust me for about 12 minutes, he said. After that, you can make your own assessment. She said nothing for 3 seconds. Then, I'm not going anywhere. I know, he said. That's why I'm here. He turned and walked back toward the center of the room. And behind him, somewhere in the infrastructure of the building that nobody in the ballroom could see, a technician received a single word through an earpiece and placed both hands on a keyboard, and all 42 digital seating displays throughout the Bellaforte estate went simultaneously, completely dark. Every screen in the Bellaforte ballroom went dark at the same moment, and the effect was more disorienting than it should have been for a room full of people who prided themselves on being unshakable. The digital displays had been running the evening's program schedule in elegant rotating text, welcome remarks, award presentations, dinner menu, donor recognition, and their simultaneous extinction pulled something out of the room's atmosphere the way a wick gets pulled from a candle. Not the light, exactly. The sense of order. 400 people in black tie looked at blank screens and then at each other. The orchestra, receiving no instruction, tapered into silence with the particular awkwardness of musicians who have lost their cue. Someone near the front said, "Is there a power issue?" Nobody answered because nobody knew, and for 11 seconds, the Bellaforte Ballroom, which had hosted governors and foreign dignitaries and 3 different sitting presidents over its 40-year history, experienced something it was not architecturally designed to accommodate: genuine uncertainty. Then the screens came back, not with the evening program, not with the donor recognition scroll, with a seating chart. One single image, clean and white, rendered in the same elegant font the foundation used for all its official materials, displayed simultaneously on every screen in the building. The ballroom read it in pieces, the way you read something you're not sure you're seeing correctly. Table assignments had been rearranged. The VIP configuration, the horseshoe of premium tables that had occupied the ballroom center for every gala in the foundation's history, the arrangement that announced hierarchy as clearly as a military rank structure, was gone. In its place, a single circular table occupied the geometric center of the room, positioned directly beneath the largest chandelier, the one that threw more light than all the others combined. One name at the head position, Nia Brooks. The silence that followed was a different kind than the one before. The first silence had been confused. This one was the silence of 400 people doing rapid calculations about what this meant, about who had done it, about what the appropriate response was, and whether there was time to formulate one before something else happened. Hargrove stood up from table 3. He didn't say anything yet. He just stood, which was itself a statement, the physical assertion of a man who responds to challenges by occupying more vertical space, as if height were a form of argument. Whitmore had gone very still at table 1. His wife's hand was on his arm, and she was leaning toward him, saying something in a voice too low to carry, and his face had the expression of someone mentally reviewing the last 3 hours and identifying every decision that had led to this particular moment. Marcus Webb, at table 4, was looking at the screens with an expression that was harder to read, something between relief and dread. The face of a man who wanted something to happen and is now watching it happen and has just realized that wanting a thing and being ready for it are not the same. And in the corner by the service entrance, Nia Brooks was looking at the screen nearest to her with the careful stillness of a woman who has learned not to react to things until she understands them completely. Her name, at the center of the room. She looked at the screen for a long count of 4. Then she looked toward the main floor where Cassian Viscari had disappeared into the crowd after their exchange, and she thought, 12 minutes. He'd said 12 minutes. She had no way of knowing if this was the beginning of those 12 minutes or the end of them, and that not knowing sat in her chest with a specific weight. Then a waiter appeared at her table. Not Tomas. A different one, older, with the efficient composure of someone who had been doing this for 20 years and had been briefed. "Ms. Brooks," he gestured toward the center of the room. "If you'd follow me, please." She looked at him. "I was told to tell you," he said, and there was something careful in his voice, something that wanted to convey information without overstepping, "that the table is yours, not as a gesture, as the arrangement." She understood the distinction he was making. She stood up. She took her water glass, not because she needed it, but because the act of carrying something gave her hands something to do, and her hands needed something to do right now, and she followed him across the ballroom floor. The walk from the corner to the center of the room was 43 feet. She counted them without meaning to, the way you count things when your mind is trying to anchor itself to something measurable while the unmeasurable is happening around it. 43 feet through a room that was watching her with the unified attention of a crowd that has forgotten to pretend it isn't watching. She felt it on her skin, not hostile, not exactly, but concentrated, the way sunlight feels when it's coming through a lens. She sat at the center table. The chandelier above her was doing what chandeliers in rooms like this are designed to do, casting light in a way that was specifically more flattering than practical, the kind of illumination that makes everyone within it look like they belong in a painting. She felt it on her face and thought, absurdly, about her emerald gown in the consignment shop and the woman who had altered it for half price because of her grandson and his pasta. She set her water glass on the table. She waited. She was the only person sitting at the center table. Around her, the room was still processing, still shifting, still doing the social mathematics of 400 people deciding whether to comply with a new arrangement or resist it. She could see the calculation happening in real time across a dozen faces, the weighing of what it would cost to sit where they were told versus what it would cost to refuse. It was Hargrove who decided it first. He was still standing at table 3. He had been standing for 2 minutes, which was long enough to have made his position visible to everyone in the room without yet committing to a direction. Then he pushed his chair in, a deliberate sound, the legs scraping against the floor, and he walked toward the main entrance with the careful pace of a man who has decided that leaving is a statement rather than a retreat. He made it 6 steps. The ballroom doors were already closed, not locked. He could see that from where he stopped. The handles were accessible. But standing in front of them, in the specific posture of personnel who have been positioned rather than wandered there, were 2 men in dark suits whose physical dimensions suggested they had been chosen for this job with some deliberateness. Hargrove stood at the closed doors for a moment. He turned around. His face had changed. Something had fallen away from it, the social performance, the easy authority of a man in his natural habitat. What was underneath it was rawer and less polished and considerably more honest. He walked back to his table and sat down. Cassian had crossed to the east side of the room while the screens were being read. He moved through the crowd without stopping, nodding at 2 people who reached for him, touching one man's shoulder briefly in a way that said "not now" without saying anything, until he reached the curtained alcove near the stage-left entrance where the Foundation's board members had been directed to gather. There were 6 of them. Marcus Webb was not yet there. He was still at table 4, Cassian noted from peripheral vision, sitting with his hands flat on the tablecloth, like he was trying to feel the table's temperature. The other 5 board members were clustered in the alcove with the expressions of people who have been given partial information and are trying to construct a complete picture from it. Jeffrey Marsh, the Foundation's legal counsel, was already there too. He had been pulled from his table 7 minutes ago and had spent those 7 minutes being told nothing useful, which had given him time to become the specific kind of anxious that lawyers become when they sense liability without yet knowing its shape. Cassian. Jeffrey stepped forward. He was 61 years old, had been with the Foundation since its 3rd year, and had the look of a man who had navigated considerable complexity in that time and was assessing this moment against all of it. "What's happening?" "I need 5 minutes with the board," Cassian said. "Then you'll have context. The auditors are in the East Suite. I know where the auditors are. I put them there." He looked at the 5 board members. One of them, a woman named Patricia Donnell, who ran a hospital network and had the disposition of someone who had spent 30 years making decisions under pressure, met his eyes with the steadiness of a person waiting for usable information rather than reacting to the absence of it. He appreciated that. 3 years of Foundation disbursements have been misallocated, he said, without preamble. The total figure is being finalized right now. It's significant. Some of it connects to donors who are in this room tonight. Silence. How significant? Patricia asked. Tens of millions. The alcove absorbed that number. Is this... Jeffrey started, then stopped, then reorganized. Is this something we identified through routine audit? Or it's something I identified through watching a woman get walked from the center of this room to a service entrance, Cassian said, which prompted me to ask questions about the people who asked for that to happen, which produced answers that required the auditors. Jeffrey looked at him for a long moment. That's a very unusual chain of causation. Yes. What do you need from us right now? I need the board on record that the Foundation cooperates fully with any regulatory inquiry that follows from tonight. I need that documented before the evening proceeds, because what happens next is going to move quickly, and I want the Foundation's position established before it does. He looked at each of them in sequence. If anyone here has a reason they can't provide that authorization, now is the time. Nobody spoke. Patricia said, "You have it." The thing about Whitmore was that he was good at this. That was what made him dangerous, specifically. Not malice, not stupidity, but competence. 22 years in public office had given him a finely calibrated sense of when a situation was changing beneath him, and the seating chart reappearing with Nia Brooks at the center had registered as a change in the specific way that only the guilty register things, not as an injustice corrected, but as a threat emerging. He had been on his phone under the table for 4 minutes. His wife knew what he was doing and had positioned herself to block the sight line from the nearest occupied table, which she did reflexively, the practiced movement of a woman who had been doing this for a long time. She was afraid, which she would not have admitted to anyone, including herself, but her left hand was gripping the tablecloth with enough force to pull the linen slightly off center, and she hadn't released it. The person Whitmore was calling didn't answer. He tried a second number, a third. On the fourth attempt, someone picked up. He said very quietly, "I need you to pull the Lindemann file and make sure the cross-references are clean." A pause while he listened. Then, "Tonight, right now. I don't care what time it is." Another pause. "Because I'm sitting in a room where Cassian Viscari just rearranged the furniture, and I need to know how much exposure we have before someone starts asking questions formally." He put the phone in his inside pocket. He picked up his wine glass. He set it down without drinking from it. His wife said very quietly, "Gerald?" "Don't," he said. "I just want to—" "Margaret." His voice was the voice of a man who has run out of the kind of patience that was ever really patience and was always just suppression. "Not now." She released the tablecloth. Across the room at table 3, Hargrove was watching Whitmore with the particular attention of 2 men who have enough shared history to read each other's threat assessments. They didn't make eye contact. They didn't need to. The fact that Hargrove was still in the room, still seated, still contained, was itself a communication. We hold. The fact that Whitmore gave a barely perceptible nod in return was the response. Agreed. What neither of them knew, what they could not have known, because the surveillance architecture of the Bellaforte estate was not publicly documented and was considerably more sophisticated than the glossy event listing suggested, was that their body language was being read in real time by a man named Gus, 23 years old, who had been doing this job for 14 months and had gotten very good at it. Gus spoke into his headset. In the East Conference Suite, an auditor picked up a pen. The new seating chart had been on the screens for 6 minutes when the maitre d' made his announcement. He was a small man named Henri, who had been doing this job for 18 years and had, in that time, presided over 5 medical emergencies, 1 fire alarm, 2 political confrontations, and a wedding that became something else entirely by the dessert course. And he had learned that the key to managing any ballroom crisis was to match the energy of the room rather than fighting it, to project the specific frequency of calm authority that suggested things were proceeding exactly as intended, even when they were not. He picked up the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, and his voice came through the ballroom sound system with the warm resonance of excellent acoustics. "We will begin our evening's program in approximately 8 minutes. We ask that guests take their seats as indicated on the updated seating arrangement. Staff are available to assist with any questions." He put down the microphone. He then stood very still and watched the room. What the room did, in the subsequent 4 minutes, was conduct the most financially and socially revealing game of musical chairs in the Bellaforte estate's 40-year history. The majority of guests moved without incident. For most of the 400 people in that room, the rearrangement was a curiosity, a dinner party wrinkle, slightly strange, easily accommodated. They found their new seats, compared notes with neighbors, speculated in low voices about what was happening, and sat down. These were people who had come to a gala for dinner and a ceremony and were still basically getting that, in a different chair. But approximately 40 guests did not move immediately. These 40 clustered at their original positions or gathered in small groups near the room's edges, and their conversations had the compressed urgency of people exchanging information that needed to travel quickly. Several were on phones. Several had the specific body language of consultation, heads together, voices low, hands moving in the gestures of people working through contingencies. Henri watched them. He knew most of their faces. This was his job, to know faces, to know what faces meant, to read a room the way a musician reads a score. And what he was reading now, in those 40-odd faces clustered at the margins of a rearranged ballroom, was fear. Not the social discomfort of people asked to change seats. Something older and more specific than that. He spoke quietly to the nearest staff member. Tell Mr. Vescari's team the South Cluster has about 14 people who haven't moved, and the group near the bar, that's maybe 8 more. The staff member relayed this. Cashin came out of the stage-left alcove at 7 minutes to 9. He came into the ballroom through the main floor this time. No side entrance, no edge approach. He walked from the curtained alcove directly into the center of the space, and the room felt him enter the way rooms feel certain people enter, which is a phenomenon that cannot be fully explained by physical presence alone, but is nevertheless completely real. People turned. Not all at once, not dramatically. A head here, a shifted gaze there. The gradual orientation of a crowd toward a gravitational point. The conversations nearest him tightened and quieted without stopping completely. The guests who were still standing in their displaced clusters near the room's edges registered his position and recalculated. Hargrove registered his position from table 3 and recalculated. Whitmore registered his position from table 1 and said nothing further to his wife and looked at the tablecloth. Cashin crossed the room to the center table. He pulled out the chair immediately to Nia's right. He sat down. The room's response was not applause, not gasps. It was something more fundamental than either, the specific silence of a large group of people having the same realization simultaneously. Because the meaning of what they were watching was not ambiguous. The man who owned the Bellaforte estate, who ran the Romano Syndicate Foundation, who had built the empire that funded everything in this room, had walked past every senator and executive and celebrity and tycoon in the building and sat down next to the woman who had been eating alone by the service entrance 40 minutes ago. That was a statement that did not require translation. Nia looked at him when he sat. He said, quietly enough that only she could hear it. The 12 minutes turned into 7. I apologize for the imprecision. She said just as quietly, what happens now? The maitre d' is going to ask the remaining guests to take their seats. He picked up his water glass. Some of them won't want to. And their seats are where yours was. He said it matter-of-factly, without inflection, and she felt the weight of that land in a way that was different from satisfaction. It was heavier than that. I considered whether it was too, he paused, choosing theatrical. Then I decided theater sometimes makes a point that logic can't. She was quiet for a moment. I don't want anyone humiliated on my behalf, she said. He looked at her then, directly, and something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but something adjacent to it. The recalibration of a man who had formulated an assumption and is encountering the thing it was based on for the first time. The seats are a consequence of their choices tonight, he said, not something done to them on your behalf. There's a distinction. Is there? I believe so, but you're entitled to disagree. She looked at the tablecloth. Then she looked at the room, at the people finding seats, at the clusters still stalled near the edges, at the scholarship kids near the stage who were watching everything with the wide-eyed attention of people trying to memorize something. And she thought about what her mother had told her about rooms like this, and what she herself had told her kids about rooms like this, and what it meant that she was sitting in the exact center of one at a table with her name on it, next to a man she'd met 11 minutes ago who appeared to have rearranged an entire institution between cocktail hour and dinner. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. Henri's voice came through the sound system again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that all guests please be seated. Our program will begin shortly." The remaining clusters at the room's edges began to move, slowly and with the specific reluctance of people making calculations until the last possible moment. Hargrove found his new seat, which was, as Cassian had specified, in the corner by the service entrance, and sat with his jacket buttoned and his face arranged in the neutral expression of a man who has decided that appearing unaffected is the only available defense. Whitmore's party moved to theirs. 8 other tables reconfigured, and in the East Conference Suite, 2 floors above, the auditors were no longer just reviewing documents. They were documenting. The award ceremony began at 9:04. The Foundation's program director, a woman named Sandra Osei, who had been doing this role for 6 years and had not been briefed on tonight's events in advance, and was therefore operating on professional instinct and a prayer she didn't know she was saying, stepped to the podium with her notes and looked out at a room that looked different than it had in any of the previous 6 years she'd run this event. She recognized the difference without knowing its cause. She felt it the way you feel weather. She began the welcome remarks. The words were the same words they'd used for years. The Foundation's mission, the spirit of the awards, the acknowledgement of donors, the recognition of the community's needs. But the room received them differently tonight, in the specific way a room receives words when the context has shifted beneath them. People listened who usually didn't, watched the podium instead of their phones. The language about dignity and community impact and honoring those who serve landed with a texture it hadn't had in previous years, because the room had just watched that language tested in real time and was still processing the results. When Sandra introduced Nia Brooks, she was reading from prepared remarks that said, "Recipient of this year's Humanitarian Service Award, founder and director of the Eastside Community Kitchen Initiative." She said it the way she'd been trained to say it, warmly, clearly, with the appropriate pause before the applause cue. The applause that came back was not the applause she'd trained for. It started at the tables nearest the center, the guests who had watched the evening unfold closest to its center of gravity, who had watched Cassian Viscari sit down next to a woman in a green dress and understood what that meant, and it moved outward across the room with the specific momentum of something that has been building longer than the moment that releases it. Nia stood. She walked to the podium. She was not a woman who cried in public. She had made that choice somewhere in her 30s, or rather, the choice had been made for her by accumulated experience. Too many rooms that would have used her tears as evidence of something, as confirmation of a story they'd already written about her. She'd learned to metabolize the difficult things later, privately, and to show up in public with whatever was left after that process. What was left tonight was something she hadn't expected. She stood at the podium and looked at the room, at the center table where Cassian sat with his water glass, at the scholarship kids near the stage who were looking up at her with the specific expression of young people watching someone who looks like them do something in a room that didn't expect to make room for them, at Marcus Webb at his table with his hands still flat on the cloth, at the corner by the service entrance where 6 expensive people in 6 expensive outfits were sitting in the place that had been designed to say, "You don't belong here." She placed her notes on the podium. She didn't look at them. "I came here tonight," she said, and her voice was steadier than she'd expected it to be, which she noted without examining too closely, "because I was told that this award existed to honor community service. I believe that. I still believe it." She paused. "I also came because I wanted the young people in my after-school program to know that someone who looked like them, someone from their neighborhood, had been recognized by an institution with this much power. That felt important." The room was absolutely still. "I spent part of this evening eating dinner alone next to a kitchen door," she said. "I want to be honest about that because the people in this room who made that happen are still in this room, and I think honesty is the only thing that makes the rest of this mean anything." In the corner, Hargrove's jaw had tightened. "I'm not going to use this time to address them," she said. "They already know what they did, and from the look of things—" Her eyes moved briefly toward the seating arrangement, toward Cassian at the center table. "Someone else has made certain points more effectively than I could." She paused. "I want to use this time to say something to the young people who came here tonight to speak about what this foundation meant to them. She found the scholarship kids near the stage. The girl with the pinned hair was looking at her with the kind of attention that lives in the body, not just the face, leaning slightly forward, hands together. "Whatever room you're in," Nia said, "you have the right to be there. Not because someone gave you permission, not because someone moved a chair, because you showed up, because you did the work, because showing up and doing the work is the only credential that actually matters. And everything else," she glanced briefly at the corner table, "is furniture." The girl with the pinned hair pressed her lips together very hard. She was not going to cry. She was doing the same thing Nia had been doing all night. It was 40 seconds after Nia returned to her seat that Jeffrey Marsh reappeared at the edge of the ballroom floor. Not through the main entrance, but through the side corridor that connected to the East Conference Suite. And the expression on his face was the specific expression of a man carrying information that has changed shape since he last handled it. He crossed to Cashin's position with the controlled urgency of someone who has been doing law long enough to know that running creates the wrong impression. He bent down. He said very quietly, into Cashin's ear, 4 sentences. Cashin's face did not change. He said equally quietly, 2 words back. Jeffrey straightened. He looked at the room. He looked at Hargrove. He looked at Whitmore. He looked at Cassian one more time, and then he went back the way he'd come. Cassian set down his water glass. He looked at Nia. She had been watching the exchange from 12 inches away with the peripheral attention of someone who has learned that what happens in the margins of a room is usually more important than what happens at its center. "Something changed," she said. It wasn't a question. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The auditors found a second layer." She waited. "The literacy initiative was a vehicle," he said. "We knew that. What we didn't know, what I didn't know, was that it was also used to route money through an education nonprofit that the foundation directly supervises, which means the corruption didn't happen adjacent to the foundation." He paused, and she heard in that pause the specific weight of a man confronting something he did not expect. It happened inside it. She looked at him. "Someone on the inside," she said. "Yes. Someone you trusted." The word landed differently than she'd intended, but not wrongly, and she saw him absorb it with the stillness of a man who has spent 30 years building a reputation on knowing who to trust and has just received evidence that the method had a hole in it. "Yes," he said. The room around them continued. The program, the voices, the ceremony proceeding through its agenda with the momentum of an event that has too many moving parts to stop cleanly. But at the center table, beneath the largest chandelier, the evening had just become something other than what either of them had expected it to be. "What does that mean?" Nia asked. "For tonight? For the foundation?" Cassian looked at the program unfolding at the podium, where Sandra Osei was introducing the next award recipient with the professional warmth of someone who did not yet know that the institution she was representing had just had a structural wall pulled out from under it. He said, "It means the people I plan to hold accountable tonight are not the only people who need to be held accountable." And across the room, near the stage-left curtain, a man Cassian had employed for 9 years felt his phone vibrate in his pocket, looked at the screen, read 3 words sent from a number he didn't recognize, and understood that whatever arrangement he had been operating under for the last 4 years had just been found by the only person in this building whose finding it actually mattered. Dario's name was not on any public document connected to the foundation, but his fingerprints were on 47 private ones. He looked across the ballroom at the back of Cassian's head. He looked at the ballroom doors. He looked at the 2 men in dark suits standing in front of them. And he understood, with the total clarity that arrives only when there is absolutely no ambiguity left, that the doors were not closed to keep guests from leaving. They were closed to keep him from Dario moved first, not toward the doors. He was smart enough to know the doors were finished as an option the moment he'd understood why they were closed. And Dario had not survived 9 years in Cassian Viscari's organization by being slow on that kind of calculation. He moved laterally, toward the stage-left curtain, toward the service corridor access that he knew existed because he had written the security layout for this building himself 4 years ago as part of his job. Because his job had always given him exactly the kind of access that makes a man either indispensable or catastrophically dangerous, depending on which side of a revelation you're standing on. He was through the curtain in 6 seconds. The man Cassian had posted at the corridor entrance was named Torres, 28 years old, good at his job, but positioned to watch the ballroom, not the curtain from the inside. Dario came through the gap from an angle Torres wasn't covering and was past him before Torres fully registered the movement. Torres said, "Hey!" Dario was already at the corridor's first junction. He turned left. Service stairs. He knew this building's bones the way you know the inside of your own hand. Every access point, every camera blind spot, every door that connected to something useful. He'd mapped it himself. He'd been proud of that work. He'd presented the security schematic to Cassian 18 months ago, and Cassian had looked at it for 30 seconds and said good and moved on, which was the highest compliment Dario had ever received from him, and which now felt like something he should examine more carefully from the other side. He took the stairs down. His phone was in his hand. He was dialing as he moved, his thumb working the screen while his feet found the steps without looking, and the call connected on the second ring and the voice on the other end said, "What's aboard everything?" Dario said. He was breathing harder than he'd expected, which surprised him because he was in good shape, had always been in good shape. But fear does something to cardio that fitness can't fully compensate for. Pull the files, wipe the secondary accounts, do it now. What happened? Vescari has auditors, they found the education layer. He hit the bottom of the stairs. Ground floor, he needed the parking structure. He needed his car. He needed 40 minutes of clear road and then a flight he would book from the car using a card that wasn't in his name. He'd had this contingency plan for 2 years. He'd hoped he'd never use it. How long do you need? 20 minutes minimum? You have 10. He pushed through the ground floor door. He stopped. Cassian was standing in the corridor. Not security. Not Torres, who was presumably still processing what had happened at the curtain junction. Cassian himself, in his tuxedo, with his hands in his pockets, standing in a ground floor service corridor beneath 400 guests and a crystal chandelier, looking at Dario with the expression of a man who has had enough time to feel everything about a thing and has come out the other side of it into something colder and more functional than feeling. Dario's phone was still at his ear. The voice on the other end was saying something. He lowered the phone and ended the call without looking at it. The corridor was narrow, fluorescent. The sound from the ballroom above came through the ceiling as a low structural vibration, the ceremony continuing, the program unaware of what was happening 2 floors below it. A pipe somewhere was dripping. The light above Cassian's head was the kind of institutional white that makes everyone look either sick or honest, and Dario couldn't tell which one he looked like right now, and suspected it was both. "How long have you been down here?" Dario asked. "Since Jeffrey came back," Cassian said. "You knew I'd run. I knew you'd try." He pulled his right hand out of his pocket. Empty. He wasn't holding anything, wasn't reaching for anything. He just wanted his hands visible, which was a thing he'd done in difficult conversations since he was 24 years old, because he'd learned that visible hands changed a room's temperature in ways that were useful. "Your exit route is covered, both of them, including the one through the east mechanical room that you built into the schematic and then quietly omitted from the copy you gave me." Dario's jaw tightened. "I found that about 6 months ago," Cassian said. "The omission." "Then why didn't you—" "Because knowing someone has a private exit isn't the same as knowing why." I was quiet for a beat. I kept hoping the why was something I could live with. The dripping pipe continued its count. Somewhere above them, Sandra Osei's voice came through the ceiling as an indistinct warmth, the program moving forward on schedule. "Cassian, don't." The word was quiet, but it had an edge that Dario had only heard 3 or 4 times in 9 years, and each time it had meant the same thing. The part of this conversation where you can manage it is finished. "Tell me who else." Dario said nothing. "Was it always Whitmore? Or did Whitmore come later?" Still nothing. Cassian moved, not toward Dario, just a shift of weight, the unconscious repositioning of a man whose patience is not infinite and has just located its edge. "I'm going to find out either way. Tonight, with the auditors, or over the next 6 weeks with people who are considerably less interested in having a conversation than I am. The only variable is whether you talk to me now or talk to someone else later, and I'd think carefully about which of those options leaves you with more." He paused, and chose the word with the particular deliberateness of someone who knows the difference between several words and wants the exact one. Latitude. Dario looked at the floor. He looked at the door he'd come through. He looked at Cassian. "Whitmore approached me," he said. 3 years ago. He knew about the Romano structure, not everything, but enough to make the approach with some leverage behind it. What leverage? A pause. Something from before you brought me on. Something I thought was buried. Cassian absorbed this. His face didn't move, but something behind it did. A small recalibration. The mental filing of a piece of information into the context it belonged in. He blackmailed you into it. It started that way. And then? Dario's mouth pressed together. And then I got paid. And I told myself the distinction still mattered, and I kept telling myself that for about 18 months, and then I stopped needing to because I'd gotten good at not thinking about it. How much went out? Total? Through everything? He exhaled through his nose. A little over 31 million. Cassian was still. The kind of still that isn't the absence of movement, but the compression of it. The feeling of a man holding a very large amount of something in a very controlled way. The education nonprofit, Cassian said. The one that connects back to the foundation directly. That was yours? The structure was Whitmore's. I provided the access. And the literacy initiative, also Whitmore. I just didn't close it when I should have. Dario's voice had gone flat, which was different from calm. It was the flatness of someone who has run out of ways to cushion a thing and is now delivering it unpackaged. I had 4 opportunities to close it, and I didn't. That's on me. All of it's on me. Cassian looked at him for a long moment. There are 2 federal investigators in the East Conference suite, he said. They arrived 11 minutes ago. Jeffrey called them. He paused. You're going to go upstairs and sit with them and tell them what you told me. You're going to give them everything, account structures, access records, communication logs. All of it. And if I don't? Then the conversation we just had gets characterized differently, Cassian said. By me. To them. And you lose the only thing you have left that's worth anything, which is the fact that you stopped running. Dario looked at the door behind him one more time. It was not a look of considering. It was the look of someone taking a final inventory of a thing they've already decided to leave behind. He turned toward the stairs. Cassian didn't move. Dario. He stopped. The thing Whitmore had on you, Cassian said. Whatever it was. It won't matter after tonight. None of it will matter the way he told you it would. Dario didn't turn around. You don't know what it was? No. But I know how those arrangements work. The leverage only functions as long as you're trying to protect something. Once you've decided to stop, he let the sentence complete itself in the corridor's silence. Dario went up the stairs. Cassian stood in the fluorescent corridor for 30 seconds after the door closed. Then he straightened his jacket, checked his watch, and went up after him. In the ballroom, the program had reached the scholarship presentations. The girl with the pinned hair. Her name was Kezia, 17 years old, 9 months from a full university scholarship, daughter of a woman who cleaned offices in the financial district at 5 in the morning so that her daughter could sleep through alarm clocks in a safe apartment. Kezia was standing at the podium. She had her notes. She was not looking at them. She was looking at the center table where Nia Brooks was sitting, and she was doing the thing Nia had told her to do, finding the person in the room who was smiling not with performance, but with the uncomplicated warmth of someone genuinely glad to be there. She'd found her immediately. She'd been finding her all evening, actually, since the conversation by the back wall. And something about knowing that face was in the audience had been the difference between the speech she'd prepared and the speech she was about to give, which were not the same speech. I grew up on Callaway Park, she said. The room, still warm from applause, quieted. Most people in this room know Callaway Park as a development project, she said. I know it as the place where my grandmother lived for 37 years, where my mother grew up, where I went to school until I was 12, and then we moved because the building was gone. No notes. Her hands were at her sides. She'd put the notes down when she realized she wasn't going to use them, and the gesture of setting them on the podium edge had felt like putting down something heavier than paper. I met Ms. Brooks when I was 14, she said. I came to her kitchen program because my school counselor said it would look good on applications, and I didn't care about cooking, and I definitely didn't want to be there. She paused. The first day, she had me practice knife work for 45 minutes, just cutting. She didn't talk about my future or my potential or any of the things adults usually talk about when they want you to understand that they expect things from you. She just showed me how to hold the knife, how to cut toward the board, not away from it, how to trust the blade if you handle it right. Nia was looking at her hands. She told me once, Kezia said, that the most important thing about cooking is that it teaches you patience doesn't mean passivity. That waiting for something to be ready isn't the same as doing nothing while you wait. You prep, you clean, you get everything in position so that when the moment comes, you're ready for it. She looked out at the room, at the center table. I didn't understand what that meant until tonight. The applause that came back was the kind that takes a second to start, because it takes a second to understand what you've just heard. Nia looked up. Kezia had already stepped away from the podium. Cassian came back into the ballroom through the main floor entrance at 9:41, and the difference in his face from when he'd left, barely 15 minutes ago, was not the kind of difference that announced itself. It was the kind that lived in the jaw, in the set of the shoulders, in the quality of attention a person brings to a room when they've done something that required everything they had and are now recalibrating what they have left. He returned to the center table. He sat. He said, I need to speak with you about something that's going to affect the rest of the evening. Nia looked at him. Dario. He was quiet for half a second. You heard that? I didn't hear anything. I watched your face when Jeffrey came back. She turned her water glass on the tablecloth. A quarter turn. Then back. He's the inside person. Yes. And now? He's upstairs with the federal investigators. She absorbed this. Is he going to be okay? The question surprised him. He could tell that it surprised him because he'd prepared for a different kind of response. Practical questions. Questions about the foundation, about the investigation's scope, about what happened next in terms of structure and consequence. He hadn't prepared for is he going to be okay, and the fact that it was the first thing she asked told him something about her that the award citation hadn't. He cooperated, Cassian said. That matters, legally. That's not what I asked. No, he said. I don't know. She nodded, slowly, like that was an answer she could work with. At table 3, Hargrove had been watching the room with the compressed attention of a man running tactical calculations and coming up short on each one. He'd watched Dario disappear through the curtain. He'd watched Cassian disappear. He'd watched them both return. He'd watched the federal investigators enter through the side corridor. He knew what federal investigators looked like. He'd been in rooms with enough of them to read the specific way they moved, the way they held themselves, the quality of their attention, and he'd felt the temperature of his own future change in real time. He had one card left. He believed it was a strong card because he'd been carrying it for 8 months and had never had to play it, and the fact that he'd never had to play it had made him trust it more than he should have. He pulled out his phone. He typed a message to a number he'd never had to use. The message said, "Invoke the insurance. Tonight. Now." He sent it. He set his phone face down on the table. He picked up his wine glass with a hand that was almost steady. Across the room, someone else's phone received that message. The person read it, looked up, looked around the room at the investigators, at the auditors moving between tables with their quiet efficiency, at the closed doors, at Cassian Viscari sitting at the center table with his jacket buttoned and his water glass untouched. They typed back 3 words. Which insurance policy? Hargrove looked at his phone. He typed, Viscari, the 2019 records. He sent it. He waited. The response took 90 seconds, which was 40 seconds longer than it should have taken, and those extra 40 seconds told him something before he even read the words. Those records were handed to the Foundation's legal team 6 weeks ago. I'm sorry, Robert. Hargrove read the message twice. Then he set his phone down, face down, and looked at the center table, and for the first time all evening, his face did something it hadn't done before. It stopped performing. The authority fell away from it, and the ease, and the practiced amusement, and what was left was just a man in a tuxedo at a corner table who had arrived at the end of something without understanding that it was ending. He reached for his wine. His hand was shaking. He saw it shaking, and he put his hand in his lap. Whitmore had seen it too. He had the senator's instinct for reading bodies across rooms. 22 years of legislative chambers had trained him to read the physical language of defeat and panic and capitulation in people 30 feet away, because in political rooms that distance is often all you have before a vote happens, and you need to know which way it's going. He read Hargrove's hand. He read the phone face down on the table. He read the specific quality of stillness that had replaced the confident restlessness Hargrove had maintained all evening. He said very quietly to his wife, We need to call the attorney. She had her phone out before he finished the sentence. She'd had it ready. She was the kind of woman who had been ready for this call for a long time, who had perhaps known longer than her husband that some version of this evening was coming and had simply not found a way to make him understand that without confronting what understanding it would require. She dialed. She kept her body positioned to shield the call from the nearest table, which was now occupied by two people she didn't recognize who had the particular listening while not appearing to listen quality of people who had been placed there to listen. The attorney answered on the second ring. She said quietly and precisely, "We need you here. In person. Bring everything." A pause on the line. Then, "Margaret, how serious? Bring everything," she said again, and disconnected. She put her phone in her purse. She looked at her husband, who was looking at the tablecloth with the expression of a man who has arrived at the last page of a story he thought he was in the middle of. "Gerald," she said. He didn't look up. "Gerald." Her voice had changed, not harder, more honest. The specific honesty of a woman who has been managing something for a long time and has just decided to stop managing it and start surviving it instead. Whatever happens tonight, whatever they have, you need to be the person who walks out of this room on your own feet. Do you understand me? Not escorted, not helped. You walk out. He looked at her. "We cooperate," she said. "We get ahead of it, whatever it costs." He was quiet for a long. Then, "Margaret, if I cooperate, what I'd have to give them. I know. It's not just the Senate seat, I know what it is." Her voice was very even. "I know exactly what it is, and I've known for 3 years, and I've been telling myself that as long as it stayed contained." She stopped. "It's not contained, Gerald. Look at this room. It's not contained." The orchestra had been asked to play through the second half of the ceremony, and they were doing so with the professional commitment of musicians who have learned to provide continuity through events they don't understand. The music was something with enough warmth in it to soften the room's edges, and under different circumstances it would have worked. Whitmore looked at the center table. He looked at Nia Brooks, who was talking to Cashin with the specific quality of attention of two people exchanging information that matters. Not socially, not performatively, just talking, the way people talk when the room stops meaning anything, and the conversation in front of you is the only thing that's real. He thought about the seating chart. He thought about his wife's request 3 hours ago, in the car on the way here. "Just don't make a scene, Gerald." He told her there wouldn't be a scene. He told her it was a charity dinner. "Okay," he said. "Okay, what?" "Okay, we cooperate." He said it again, as if the repetition was part of what made it real. "We get ahead of it." Margaret exhaled. It was the first time she'd fully exhaled since they'd walked through the Bellaforte's front door. At 9:58, Jeffrey Marsh returned to the ballroom floor. He came directly to the center table and crouched beside Cashin's chair in the specific posture of a lawyer delivering information that requires privacy in a public space, and he spoke for approximately 45 seconds. Cassian listened without his expression changing, which was the thing about him that Nia had been watching all evening. The extraordinary discipline of a face that had been trained to receive information without broadcasting it, that processed internally and presented nothing until processing was complete. When Jeffrey finished, Cassian said 2 words. Jeffrey straightened and went back toward the east corridor. Nia said, "What now?" Cassian picked up his water glass for the first time since he'd sat back down. He drank. He set it down. "Whitmore's attorney is on the way. They're going to cooperate." "And Hargrove?" "Hargrove's insurance policy was handed to our legal team 6 weeks ago by the person who was holding it. He's been running on an empty hand since approximately March." A pause. "He doesn't have many options left." "What does he have?" Cassian looked toward table 3. At the corner table, Hargrove was sitting with his empty wine glass and his face that had stopped performing, and his phone face down, and his hands in his lap, and the specific posture of a man who has exhausted his contingencies and is now in the strange, still territory that exists on the other side of them. "Right now," Cassian said, "he has the choice of whether to stand up and walk to the conference suite himself or wait for someone to come to the table." "Which do you think he'll choose?" Cashin was quiet for a moment. "I think he'll choose to walk," he said. "Men like Hargrove, they need the performance of control even when the control is gone. He'll walk because sitting and waiting feels like less of him, and he can't afford to feel like less of himself right now. He paused. He'll walk, and he'll spend the entire walk calculating whether there's still an angle he hasn't tried, and there won't be, but the calculating will feel better than the walking. Nia looked at him. You understand people like that very well, she said. It wasn't an accusation, it was just an observation, offered plainly, the way she offered things. He met her eyes. I've spent 30 years in rooms with them, he said, including a pause that had weight. Rooms with myself. She held his gaze. That's either the most honest thing someone said to me tonight, she said, or the most strategic. It can be both. Can it? In my experience, he said, the honest things usually are. She considered that. On the program, Sandra was introducing the final award of the evening. The room had settled into something different from what it had been at 7 o'clock, quieter under its surface, the way water gets quiet when something large has moved through it and the ripples have traveled to the edges and come back as stillness. People were at their assigned seats. The ceremony was completing. The crystal chandeliers were doing what they'd always done, throwing their light across the room without opinion. At table 3, Hargrove stood up. He buttoned his jacket. He walked toward the east corridor. He walked alone, without escort, which was the choice Cassian had predicted and which cost him something visible in the set of his back and the deliberateness of each step, the performance of control from a man who had none left, doing it anyway because that was all that was left to do. Nobody in the ballroom watched him go. Nobody except Nia, who watched him all the way to the door, and Cassian, who didn't need to watch because he'd already seen it in his peripheral vision and had filed it away under things that were finished. And Marcus Webb, at table 4, who watched Hargrove's back disappear through the corridor door and felt something in his chest loosen that had been tight since he was 28 years old, and first understood that the rooms where decisions got made weren't the rooms they told you about. He exhaled. He picked up his water glass. He thought, it isn't enough. It's never enough. But it's something. He drank. And at the podium, Sandra's voice said the name of the final award recipient, and the room applauded, and the orchestra played its bridge. And above all of it, in the East Conference suite on the 3rd floor, a federal investigator opened a laptop, and a man who had worked for Cassian Viscari for 9 years and had betrayed him for 4 began to speak. And the words came out not in the organized sequence of a prepared statement, but in the ragged, uneven rhythm of a person unloading something they've been carrying so long. They've forgotten what standing upright feels like without the weight. And the investigator typed steadily and didn't look up. And the words kept coming. And outside the door, 2 men in dark suits stood with their hands at their sides. And the corridor was quiet, except for the voice inside the room and the distant structural vibration of music coming up through the floor from a ballroom where 400 people were finishing a dinner that had... The words kept coming for 2 hours and 14 minutes. That was how long Dario talked. Not continuously. There were pauses, moments when the investigator asked him to clarify a date or a transfer amount or the name of an account structure. And Dario would stop and think with the specific quality of attention of a man no longer managing his answers but actually trying to get them right. The difference was visible. The investigator, whose name was Reyes and who had been doing this work for 16 years, had learned to read the difference between a person performing cooperation and a person actually cooperating, and what she was watching across the conference table was the second thing, ragged and unglamorous and occasionally painful to sit across from, but real. He gave her everything. The account numbers, the routing structures, the communication records he'd preserved, not because he'd planned to use them as leverage, but because he was a man who kept records professionally and had never fully separated that habit from his personal arrangements, which was the kind of operational mistake that only looks like a mistake in retrospect. The names of intermediaries, the dates of transfers, the specific mechanism by which the Southeast Literacy Initiative had been connected to the Foundation's education nonprofit through a series of subgrant agreements that looked legitimate in isolation and revealed their purpose only when you laid them side by side. He gave her Whitmore's name 6 times, in 6 different contexts. He gave her Hargrove twice. He gave her 2 other names that neither Reyes nor her colleague Brandt had encountered in the initial document review, and those names caused a pause in the room. Brandt looking up from his laptop, Reyes setting down her pen, the 2 of them exchanging the specific glance of investigators who have just had the shape of a case change beneath them. "Say those names again," Reyes said. Dario said them again. She wrote them down carefully, which was not how she usually took notes. Usually she typed. But some things you write by hand because the act of forming the letters with a pen makes them more real, or makes you more accountable to their reality. And you have documentation connecting them to the transfer structure. "The documentation exists," Dario said. "I don't have it on me. It's on a server I can give you access to." He paused. "I set the server up myself. It's not registered to anything connected to my name. I built in that protection for myself and then never used it." He said this last part with the tone of a man delivering a verdict on his own judgment. The irony is not lost on me. Reyes looked at him. "Mr. Dario, I want to make sure you understand what you've just provided." "I understand." "If the documentation supports what you've described, this investigation expands significantly beyond what we came in here expecting tonight." "I know. The individuals you've named, 2 of them have substantial political and institutional protection." "I know that too." He looked at his hands on the table. They were still. He'd managed to stop them shaking about 40 minutes in, which had required a specific, deliberate act of will that he'd had to repeat every 5 minutes since. The protection is part of the structure. It was designed to make the thing look untouchable, but it was also designed by people who believed they'd never be in a room like this one, giving the information to someone like you. He looked up. "They were wrong about that." Reyes held his gaze for a moment. Then she asked her next question, and Dario answered it, and the room continued its work. Downstairs, the gala had reached its end. Not the end of the program. The program had concluded at 10:40 with the final award presentation and Sandra's closing remarks, which she had delivered with the particular grace of a woman who had sensed all evening that something large was happening just outside her line of sight, and had chosen to do her job impeccably rather than try to understand it. She thanked the guests, she thanked the staff, she thanked the Foundation's leadership without naming Cassian specifically, because he hadn't been in her sightline when she'd rehearsed that part, and she'd made a professional judgment call to leave it general. The room applauded. The orchestra played the closing piece, and then the 400 people of the Bellaforte Gala began the process of an evening ending, the retrieval of wraps and bags, the gathering of table favors, the resumption of conversations that had been interrupted by ceremony, the general loosening that happens when a formal event releases its structure and people remember they are themselves again rather than attendees. Except that the ballroom doors were still closed. Not all of them. The East Corridor doors had been opened at 10:15 to allow the departure of the 6 investigators and auditors who had completed their preliminary work and needed to return to their offices. But the main entrance, the grand double doors at the ballroom's north end, through which the guests had arrived, remained closed, and the 2 men in dark suits remained at their positions, and this fact was registering differently now than it had registered at 9 o'clock, when most guests had been too engaged with the evening to notice it consciously. Now they noticed. The conversations that had been resuming began to stop and restart with different content. People near the doors tested them, not forcefully, just the natural movement of someone expecting an exit, and found them unyielding and looked at the suited men with the questions that suited men at doors are specifically trained not to answer. Senator Whitmore's attorney had arrived at 10:20 through the side entrance and was currently in a room adjacent to the East Conference Suite. Whitmore himself had been escorted there at 10:31, walking with the posture Cassian had predicted, deliberate, controlled, the performance of a man choosing his own direction even when the direction was not his choice. His wife had been asked to remain in the ballroom, and she was sitting at her reassigned corner table, the one by the service entrance, with her purse in her lap and her hands folded over it, and her face doing the careful, preserved work of a woman who has decided that composure is the last thing she owns outright, and she will not surrender it. Nobody approached her table, not to gloat, not to comfort. People simply gave her the same invisible radius they had given Nia Brooks 3 hours ago, which was not the same act but produced the same geography, and if Margaret Whitmore felt the parallel, she gave no sign of it. Hargrove had been in the East Suite for 90 minutes. His conversation with Reyes's colleague Brandt had been shorter than Dario's and considerably less cooperative, which Brandt had expected and had prepared for. Hargrove was a man with a lawyer's instinct even without a law degree. He knew what not to say, knew how to answer questions with questions, knew the specific grammar of a person protecting themselves while appearing to engage. But Brandt also had Dario's documentation and Dario's testimony and the communication records from Hargrove's own phone that had been lawfully accessed when Hargrove had agreed, in writing 2 years ago, to certain disclosure provisions as part of a foundation donor agreement that his attorneys had apparently not read carefully enough. When Brandt put the first page of transfer records on the table in front of Hargrove, Hargrove read it. He sat back. He said, "I need my attorney." "Your attorney is in the building," Brandt said. "He's been in the building since 10:50. He can join us whenever you'd like." Hargrove looked at the transfer record. He looked at Brandt. He said, "Get him." Cassian was in the ballroom when the doors finally opened. It was 11:17, and the opening of the doors had been preceded by a brief conversation between him and the senior investigator who had arrived at 10:40, a man named Caldwell, gray-haired, with the economical manner of someone who had been in rooms like this one many times and had learned to calibrate his presence to the minimum effective amount. They had spoken for 8 minutes in the stage-left alcove. When the conversation ended, Caldwell had nodded once, and the doors had been opened. The guests had filed out in the particular way of people who have been contained without being told they were contained, quietly, without discussing the containment, with the self-protective social agreement that the most dignified response to an ambiguous situation is to treat it as normal. Some of them would talk about it later. Most of them would find ways to minimize it in the retelling, because the thing about being in a room when something like this happens is that proximity is its own kind of implication, and people prefer the version of the story where they were observers rather than participants. Nia was still at the center table. She'd stayed through the departure of 370-something guests. Not because she'd been asked to, she hadn't, but because leaving had felt like the wrong thing, and she'd learned a long time ago to trust that feeling even when she couldn't fully explain it. She'd watched the room empty with the attention she'd brought to everything tonight. Specific, quiet, not performing anything, just watching. The scholarship kids had come to say goodbye. All 3 of them had found her at the center table before joining the exit flow, and the conversations had been brief, but each of them had landed with a different weight. The first boy, a kid named Jerome, who'd spoken about his engineering scholarship with the careful precision of someone who had rehearsed until the feeling was almost gone, had shaken her hand and then looked at the handshake like he was surprised he'd done it. The second, a girl named Rosa, had hugged her without warning, and Nia had hugged her back with the full presence of someone who doesn't do things halfway. And Rosa had left a lip gloss print on the shoulder of the emerald gown that Nia would not notice until she got home. Kezia had been last. She'd stood at the edge of the center table for a moment before sitting down in the chair beside Nia, not asking, just sitting, which was itself a kind of confidence that she probably didn't know she was displaying. She'd looked at the room, at the nearly empty ballroom, at the chandelier still running at full capacity, despite the absence of an audience, at the corner table by the service entrance where a few abandoned place settings still held the fossils of an interrupted dinner. "Did you know?" Kezia asked. "Before tonight. Did you know what was going to happen?" "No," Nia said. "Were you scared?" Nia thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. "I was..." She paused, finding the honest word. "Tired. I've been tired for a long time. Scared is something you feel when something is new. What happened to me tonight wasn't new." Kezia was quiet for a moment. "That's worse." "Yes," Nia said. "It is." "But you stayed." "I stayed." Kezia looked at the chandelier. "I want to be like that," she said, and it was the simplest thing she'd said all evening, stripped of the speech preparation language and the scholarship application framing, just a 17-year-old girl saying something true in an empty room. "I don't know if I am, but I want to be." "You already are," Nia said. "You just haven't been tested enough times to know it yet." Kezia had looked at her for a moment, and then she'd nodded. Not the way people nod when they're being polite, but the way people nod when they're storing something. And she'd left. Now the ballroom was quiet. Cassian came back to the center table. He sat down across from her this time, not beside her, and the difference in position changed something about the conversation before it started. Made it more honest, somehow, or at least more direct. You look at someone across a table differently than beside them. "It's done," he said. She waited. Whitmore is cooperating fully. His attorney negotiated the terms in approximately 40 minutes, which is either a testament to efficiency or a sign that the attorney knew this was coming and had the paperwork ready. He He set his hands on the table. Hargrove took longer. He'll cooperate eventually. He has no remaining leverage, and his attorney confirmed that tonight. But he'll fight the framing as long as he can because that's what men like that do. They can't stop performing even when the theater's closed. And Dario? Cassian was quiet for a beat. Dario talked for over 2 hours, he said. He gave them more than they expected, including names that will take months to fully investigate. He paused again, and in the pause was the specific weight of something personal being acknowledged without being performed. He's going to face serious consequences. The cooperation will matter, but it won't be clean for him. Does he have family? The question seemed to find a place in him that wasn't defended. A sister, 2 nephews. He looked at the tablecloth. She doesn't know any of this. She thinks he runs private security for a legitimate estate management firm. She'll find out now. Yes. Nia let that sit for a moment. Then, he made his choices. That's true. But the person who first put him in the position to make those choices is the one who bears the real weight. Whitmore. Whitmore, she confirmed. Cassian looked at her. You're generous with that. I'm not generous, she said. I've watched people get cornered for 20 years and then watched everyone act surprised when cornered people do what cornered people do. Understanding how something happened isn't the same as excusing it. He was quiet for a long moment. The Foundation's board is convening tomorrow morning, he said. Extraordinary session. The disbursement irregularities, the governance failures, the donor relationships that need to be severed. It's going to take months to work through, possibly longer. He looked at her directly. The board is going to need to make significant structural changes to demonstrate that the institution is capable of being what it claims to be. I'll be pushing for those changes. But I'm 1 vote. You're the primary funder. That doesn't make me 1 vote less, he said. It makes me 1 vote more, which isn't the same as a majority. She looked at him. Why are you telling me this? He was quiet for a moment. The chandelier above the empty center table continued to throw its light across the vacant room because no one had yet sent the instruction to dim it. In the stillness, the Belafort ballroom looked exactly like what it was, a beautiful space built for a specific kind of performance, currently vacant of the performance and revealed as simply a room with walls and ceiling and light and the ordinary weight of what had happened in it. Because I'm going to recommend you for the Community Partnership Directorship, he said. And I wanted to tell you here before the recommendation goes to the board so that you could tell me no before it becomes something that has its own momentum. She said nothing for a moment. You don't know me, she said. I know your file. I know what I watched tonight. I know that when you were handed the worst table in the building, you used it to prepare 3 teenagers for their speeches and then went back to it and waited without asking anyone to fix it. He held her gaze. I know what kind of person does that and what kind of person doesn't. The directorship, she said. What would it actually mean? Not the language in the letter. What would it mean? He considered this with the seriousness she'd asked it with. Resources. More than you currently have access to. Structural connection to institutions that have been ignoring neighborhoods like yours for 40 years. The ability to demand accountability from programs that take foundation money and deliver nothing, because right now the foundation has no mechanism for that accountability, which is part of how tonight happened. He paused. It would mean sitting in rooms that will not always want you there, with considerably more power to remain in them than you had tonight. And what do you want from it? The question was clean and unambiguous, and he received it that way. The foundation to be what it said it was when I built it, he said. I started this institution because I had money, and I had... He paused, and she had the sense of a man choosing honesty over impressiveness, which was not always the same choice. Guilt. Complicated guilt about the sources of that money. And I thought building something that did good work would resolve that. What I actually built was a machine that good people used for good purposes and corrupt people used for corrupt ones, and I spent years making sure the machine ran rather than making sure I understood who was operating it. He looked at the empty room. Tonight I watched a woman who runs a community kitchen with second-hand equipment and volunteers, and no real institutional support, get walked to a service entrance by people who have been taking $31 million out of the institution that's supposed to serve her community. And I thought... He stopped. What? She said. I thought, I built the machine that made that possible. The machine that gave those people the cover and the resources and the credibility to do what they did. And I also built the award that brought her here. Both things are true, and I have to— He stopped again. I have to decide what I'm going to do with both being true. The room held the silence after that for a moment. Then Nia said, I'll think about the directorship. That's fair. I'm not saying no. I'm saying I need to think about it, because it's a large decision, and I don't make large decisions in ballrooms at midnight after someone tried to seat me next to a dishwasher. Something moved in his face. The thing that wasn't quite a smile but lived in the same neighborhood. Also fair. I have questions, she said, about governance, about my independence within the role, about what the foundation is actually going to look like after the board session tomorrow and the ones after that. And I want to talk to my community before I make any commitment, because the people I serve are the ones who would be affected by anything I take on, and I don't make decisions about them without them. Those are exactly the right questions, he said, and the process you described is exactly the right one. I know, she said, without inflection. He held her gaze for a moment, then, Can I ask you something? You can ask. What made you stay tonight? After they moved you? What was the thing that made you decide not to leave? She was quiet for long enough that he thought she might choose not to answer. Then, My mother used to say that when someone tries to move you out of a room, the most powerful thing you can do is stay in it. Not perform staying, not make a speech about staying, just be there. Take up the space, let the staying be the whole argument. She looked at the empty center table, at the place card with her name that was still sitting in the head position, slightly askew now from the evening's movement. I've spent my whole life being told, in different ways, that I'm not the right kind of person for the room I'm in. And I've spent my whole life deciding that information belongs to the people who offer it, not to me. He said nothing. Tonight was hard, she said, and her voice changed slightly on that sentence, became something more unguarded than everything before it, closer to the actual temperature of the evening. I want to be honest about that. It was hard, and it hurt, and the bread roll was terrible, and I'm not going to pretend that any of it was easy, or that I handled it with grace. I was angry. I was tired. I broke that bread into about 40 pieces without eating any of it. She looked at her hands. But I was also there, and being there mattered more than anything else I could have done. Cassian looked at her hands. Then he looked at her face. Yes, he said. It did. Marcus Webb left the Bellaforte estate at 11:41. He retrieved his coat from the coat check. A woman who handed it to him without looking up because she'd been handing coats to people for 4 hours and had entered the meditative state of someone performing a repetitive task through its completion. And he walked through the building's main entrance and down the lantern-lit driveway toward the place where the valets were no longer moving quickly because the rush had passed. He stood on the driveway for a moment. The night air was cold in the way autumn gets cold at the edges, and he stood in it without putting on his coat, holding it over one arm the way he'd been carrying things all evening. The lanterns along the drive threw orange light across the pruned hedges. Somewhere in the estate's upper floors, lights were still on in rooms he couldn't name. He thought about the 9 years. He joined the board at 53, after a career in public health administration that had given him a thorough education in the distance between what institutions said and what institutions did. He joined because he believed the Bellaforte Foundation could be different. Not naive belief, not uninformed belief, but the specific belief of someone who has spent a career working inside flawed systems and knows that the flaw is never the system itself, but always the people operating it, and that different people can make different systems out of the same machinery. He'd been right about that in principle. He'd been wrong about those specific people, and he'd spent 9 years making the calculation he'd described to himself as pragmatic. The calculation that said 70% of what he saw was too costly to confront, and 30% was enough to work with, and that the work he did in the 30% was worth the cost of the 70. He told himself this so many times it had become a rhythm rather than a thought. He'd stopped examining it. Tonight had not allowed him to stop. He thought about the moment he'd walked to Whitmore's table, the anger that had gotten him there, the inadequacy of the words he'd found once he arrived. The way she's sitting next to a dishwasher had been the most effective thing he'd said all evening, and it hadn't been enough to change anything directly. It had just been true, said out loud, in a room where too many true things had been staying quiet for too long. He put on his coat. He thought, tomorrow the board convenes. Tomorrow there will be an agenda and motions and amendments and the grinding formal machinery of institutional change. And some of it will go the way tonight went, faster and more completely than he expected. And some of it will be resisted in the specifically exhausting way that institutions resist the acknowledgement of their own failures. He would be there. He would be in the 30% and the 70% both this time, which was going to be harder and was the only thing he could do that would be worth calling change rather than management. His car arrived. He got in. He looked out the window at the Bellaforte estate as the car moved down the driveway. The building's lit windows receding in the rear glass, getting smaller and then gone as the car turned through the gate onto the public road. He was quiet for the whole ride home. Maya left at 12:03. She retrieved her small bag from the coat check, she'd had no coat, and walked out through the main entrance and stood on the front steps for a moment in the cold air, letting it do what cold air does after a long evening inside, which is real and immediate and uncomplicated in a way that nothing else from the past 5 hours had been. The driveway was mostly empty, a few cars still moving. A valet jogging between the vehicle lanes with the particular energy of someone finishing a long shift who has found a second gear. She thought about the emerald gown. She thought about the consignment shop, the woman who had altered it, the grandson who made pasta and cried about it in the best way. She thought about her kitchen on Morrison Street, and the cracked tile floor, and the second-hand oven that had a temperature calibration issue they'd been working around for 2 years, and the folding table she used as a desk, where an invitation in a cream envelope had arrived on a Tuesday and changed the direction of something, though she hadn't known that then. She thought about Kezia at the podium. About patience doesn't mean passivity. She hadn't told Kezia she'd said that. She barely remembered saying it. You say things to kids in kitchens, and you don't track where they go. You just say the true things and trust that some of them land somewhere useful, and then 6 months later, or 3 years later, or a decade later, someone says it back to you in a room where 400 people are watching, and it sounds completely different than it did when it left your mouth, because it has traveled through another person's understanding of their own life and come back transformed. That was the whole thing, she thought. That was the whole thing about this work, and about staying in rooms, and about the bread roll, and the emerald gown, and the 9 years Marcus Webb had spent on a board that needed him, and the 2+ hours Dario had spent in a conference room telling the truth, and the way Kezia's shoulders had dropped 2 inches during a conversation about knife work and public speaking. None of it was clean. None of it arrived with a guarantee. You put things into the world, and you watched them move through people, and you tried to be honest about what you could and couldn't see from where you were standing. You stayed. You were there. You let the being there be the argument. Her car arrived. She opens the door and stopped. She looked back at the Bellaforte estate, at the lit windows on the upper floors, at the lanterns still running along the driveway, at the grand entrance with its carved stone and its history and its 40 years of events that had looked different from the inside than they did from the outside. She looked at the place where the main doors were. She thought about walking through them, about the way her name had looked on a digital display in the center of that room, about Cassian's face when she'd asked if Dario was going to be okay, and the way he'd said, "I don't know," with the specific weight of someone who was no longer in the business of performing certainty. She thought about the directorship. She didn't decide anything. She got in the car. The last light in the Bellaforte estate went out at 2:47 in the morning. Not the last light literally. The security system maintained perimeter lighting, and the East Conference Suite stayed lit until 3:15 when the investigators finally packed their equipment and left through the side entrance with 7 external drives and 4 boxes of documents, and a case that had expanded twice in size since they'd walked in. But the last interior light, the chandelier above the center table, which had been running continuously since 7 in the evening, went dark at 2:47 when the overnight facilities manager worked his way through the ballroom's lighting grid with the methodical attention of someone who has cleaned up after large events many times and knows that the details that seem minor are the ones that cost you later. He reached the chandelier controls. He looked up at it. It was an extraordinary piece of work, hand-assembled, crystal and brass, throwing prismatic light across whatever it hung above. He'd looked at it hundreds of times and still looked at it this particular way once a night, the way you look at something beautiful that you're responsible for maintaining, which is a specific mix of pride and obligation that doesn't have a clean name. He turned the dial. The chandelier went dark. In the room's remaining security lighting, the low, functional illumination that made the space navigable without making it visible, the center table sat empty under where the light had been. The place card with Nia Brooks' name was still there, slightly askew. The water glasses had been collected, the linens would be changed in the morning, and by next week the room would be reset for whatever event came after this one. But the place card was still there. The facilities manager saw it as he walked past. He stopped. He straightened it, the way he straightened things. Not thinking about it, just the reflex of a man who maintained things and saw what needed doing. Then he walked on, and the room was quiet, and the Bellaforte estate held its darkness with the particular patience of buildings that have been the site of things, and understand that the things matter more than the building, and the morning would come, and people would come with the morning, and whatever the foundation was going to become would begin then. The place card sat straight, Nia Brooks, still there.